Wicked is the first of two parts as acting as a prequel to The Wizard of Oz, but does it capture the spectacle? Hello and welcome to Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you seen Wicked? Is it good? Is it bad? Or somewhere right in the middle? Or if you're waiting for this review to decide if you're going to see it or not, make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we're talking about the love of cinema as a whole and getting right into the synopsis. With Elphaba being an ostracized girl with green skin and Glinda being the popular one, there's just something that really brings their friendship to the test when facing the Wizard of Oz and all the plans and differences they have to face. And getting right into the positives, there's so many great things about just the production value to this film that just kicks it right off the bat, and getting the idea that this is a musical. I'm sure a lot of musical fans will love it. People that aren't familiar with the context of this story, this is based on a book that later inspired a Broadway musical that inspired this film to become to life. This is part one of two movies. It is a lengthy film for the nature of how you're telling the story. Certain things are extended out because of what you're having to do with the musical numbers and just what we're getting out of Elphaba, played by Revo. Her performance is just great. It's beautiful by the nature of how they're portraying her character. The different thematic elements that are all going in with racism of some sorts, to the nature of a girl being different for her green skin, being born with that, having to try and tell everyone and explain every time she meets someone what's all going on and the nature of what that all comes about, and having to fake that she doesn't care about people judging her for her skin color, but she's defiant, and that's a great character trait that really pops out of her role. It brings it into certain circumstances that are troublesome. But there's also Glinda, played by Ariana Grande, and she is just the opposite, but fun in her chipper sense. How you get her, the singing throughout this film is great, especially for those two, Elphaba and Glinda, and so the nature of how that's all pulled out just pulls off this great prequel story that, having read the book with a class like several years ago, the story is sort of coming back to me. I don't remember how it all plays out in the end, what we're getting in part two, but still what we're getting out of this film on its own just feels like it has a grand scale. There's great props, great setups to the nature of how this film is produced, the visual effects, certain color grading with pink or green, depending on which scenes you're focusing on Glinda, on Elphaba, and there's just some great songs throughout that just has a great soundtrack, especially leading on to the end with Defying Gravity. And there's also Popular, which are two of my favorite ones that particularly stick out. I've heard them before, but being able to put them to a picture, and me having not seen a Broadway musical, just pulls off something different. And as a cinematic experience, it certainly is one to put on the biggest screen possible. It's enjoyable to nature of how you're pulling off the story and having these great thematic elements of judgment, desperation. It's something you sort of have seen before, but the nature of it still being pulled off, especially being based on an older book of the time where that might not have been a trope at the time, just goes about these different ways, where we also have Michelle Yeoh and Jeff Goldblum as a wizard, and how you get in those characters, other side characters that come about along the way, have their own respective roles that works effectively for the nature of what this story is really begging for it. And ultimately, the landscape of this film is really great by the nature of the cinematography, what all is pulled off. There's certainly some great visuals that the director is doing something familiar. He has directed musicals before, such as In the Heights from John Chu, and so how that gets pulled off, it feels experienced to looking up, looking down, doing all these different camera angles and movements that shows a flow to the music, flow to the story. And so that just brings out something nice, that the narrative has something to say with what you're acting as a prequel to The Wizard of Oz. And so that also pulls about these unique elements where you're leading up these pieces of evidence along the way, showing how certain things are set up, pieces of articles or clothing, how Elphaba gets her name, how she becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, slowly transcending in the nature of how things are getting set up. So that becomes interesting by the nature of how that makes sense as pieces of the puzzle are adding up together. Getting right into mix elements, there's so many great characters throughout this, but when you have a strong focus on Glinda and on Elphaba, there's certain actors that may have good performances, but they're such a small part of the story that having two grand performances and then other performances that sort of get put to the back burner a little bit too much, even if they're a secondary side character, it sort of makes you dismiss them a little bit more, making the runtime that's extra long feel even longer, because you're not necessarily getting too much out of the other characters, even when those characters have extensive scenes that pair with the main two. And so there's not too much that you're ultimately getting from what's all going out in the beginning, flowing throughout the story. These side characters that are aiding Glinda, sort of just giving a representation characters to who is supporting Glinda, the ones closest to her. And then Fiyero is sort of another love interest that sort of builds upon the nature of the story, but doesn't necessarily, at least for this being a part one, fully encapsulate something that does a little bit more to the story. And there's also pieces to the puzzle, such as Michelle Yeoh and Jeff Goldblum, that don't necessarily sing too well. They have great performances, they're great actors, but there's something about their voices for the song that doesn't sing too well with the nature of what they're adding to the film itself. And of course, for me personally, there were some elements of the film when they went into the history, this being a prequel, knowing pieces of a puzzle that are adding up to the Wizard of Oz, such as the clothing of the Wicked Witch, as well as different other things to the winged monkeys, the Yellow Brick Road, other things that are just building up what we're getting in Wizard of Oz. It felt like a direct nod that felt a little too obvious. Maybe it's not supposed to be blunt in its nature, but that's what it came off a little bit to me. Is I know all these things come to life, and certain pieces don't necessarily need to be explained so specifically, such as the Yellow Brick Road, but they sort of create an explanation that's not necessarily in depth, but leading to that doesn't feel like it needs to be as explicit to the nature of what all this story is asking for it, which takes me into the negatives, to which just a little bit, the runtime can be a bit too long. Now, I can be very mixed on musicals as a whole, so this could be just for a piece of evidence for whether you like musicals, whether you don't. I'm sort of right in the middle for musicals, and this one, yes, I've mentioned all these great spectacle moments, all these great pieces of the film that makes it a great film, but the runtime, maybe because I'm familiar with this being a prequel film and with my mix element problems, there's all of these things that sort of detract from it from being original, since I know everything that's going to lead on into The Wizard of Oz. So that's sort of what made this film drag out, not only because the songs can have their own thing, not being tightly edited. While the editing can be good, obviously when you're adding all these extra songs that don't necessarily aid the story outside of being the musical performances that they are, those are really good, but it also still can make the film feel very drawn out to the nature of what I personally feel can really attach to me as a whole. So that's just my personal review for Wicked, which I have to rate a personal 7.5 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you seen Wicked? Is it good? Is it bad? Or somewhere right in the middle. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all. And make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.